Hello everybody, welcome to the muscular system. So this will be Unit 4, and in contrast to Unit 3, I would say the physiology side for Unit 4 is a little more complicated than the anatomy side. Some of these things kind of flip-flop back and forth as we move through the unit. So expect to devote some significant time to working through the muscular system physiology. I'm not trying to freak you out, but it takes a little work. This is going to be your first really heavy-duty body function unit where we're going to get into some details about what it takes for the muscles in your body to contract. And also another reason why this particular unit is a little more heavy duty on the physiology side is we're also going to hit one of the more complex topics about how your nervous system works. So even though I have these slides labeled as Chapter 9 physiology slides, in some sections we'll actually be jumping over into Chapter 11 a little bit. The reason for that is because the muscles of your body, your skeletal muscles, the ones that you use for movement, don't contract without input from the nervous system. So it's a little difficult to talk about the muscular system without jumping ahead and discussing parts of the nervous system as well. So just be forewarned, this unit will have some of the more complex physiology, actually, of any unit that you'll have in either Biology 201 or 202. This unit also kind of gets you prepared for what Biology 202 is going to be like, because Biology 202 is a little more heavy duty on the physiology side and not quite so heavy duty on the anatomy side. All right, so in our first lecture here, we're just going to introduce muscle tissues and functions to you. We heard a little bit of this before back in Unit 2 when we learned about tissues. We mentioned that there are three types of muscle tissue. You have skeletal muscle tissue, you have cardiac muscle tissue, and then you have smooth muscle tissue. And so we're going to review a little bit about those three different types. Chapter 9, mainly we're going to be focusing in on the skeletal muscles, and the reason for that is your cardiac muscles you're going to hear a whole lot more about when you take the second semester of A&P, and then smooth muscle, that comes into play more also in the second semester of A&P as you study things like how your blood vessel walls contract and contractions that take place within the digestive system. So we will review these three types of muscle tissue, but just keep in mind the vast majority of our time here in Chapter 9 we're going to be spending on skeletal muscle tissue, as you see here on the first slide. All right, so skeletal muscle tissue is attached to your bones and also to your skin and some of the softer tissues in some cases. It's striated, which means if you look at it under a microscope, it looks striped. That's what striated means. Skeletal muscle tissue falls into the voluntary category. So your other two types, cardiac and smooth muscle, are not under voluntary control. You cannot will them to move. Your skeletal muscles you can. Now that does not mean that your skeletal muscles only contract when you're thinking about it. But you can control them. We have skeletal muscles all the time that are contracting without us thinking about it. For example, my ability to sit upright here in this chair without falling to the ground like a limp rag doll involves contractions of skeletal muscles that are important for maintaining posture. And I'm not thinking about that, that's happening. But on the other hand, I can willfully contract skeletal muscles as well when I want to make particular movements. Skeletal muscle tissue is very powerful, and we'll see why that is as we move through the unit. Capable of generating strong contractions, and those contractions trigger, in most cases, movements of bones at joints. Muscles pull on bones. That's something I'll be hitting heavily on the anatomy side. In other cases, muscles are attached to softer tissues, especially up here in the face, and they control things like your facial expressions. All right, then cardiac muscle tissue, which we talked a little bit about back in Unit 2, that's only located in the heart. It's also striated, which means it looks striped if you look at it under the microscope. It is involuntary, though. Obviously, you don't have to think about making your heart beat. And you'll talk about more details about cardiac muscle tissue and its details when you get to chapter 18 in AMP2. So we're not really going to spend any time on that here. And then smooth muscle tissue, just to review, and again, we covered some of this back in Unit 2. Where do you find smooth muscle? Smooth muscle is found in places like the walls of your hollow organs. So your stomach, really your entire digestive tract, all the way from the esophagus through the stomach, small intestine, large intestine, all the way to the end. You've got smooth muscle tissue within the walls of those organs that contracts to help propel the foods and the beverages that you're consuming and digesting. The urinary bladder is another place. The wall of the urinary bladder contracts when you need to excrete urine. The air passages throughout your respiratory system, you actually have smooth muscle tissue within that tubing as well. Smooth muscle tissue is not striated, so if you looked at it under the microscope, it would not look striped. And what it really looks like are a bunch of very thin, spindly-looking cells that are linked together. And those individual cells are capable of contracting when that smooth muscle needs to do that. Involuntary, you don't think about contracting your smooth muscle. Another place for smooth muscle tissue, I want you guys to go ahead and think about blood vessels. Let me write that in there as well. That's important. For example, when we talked a little bit about vasoconstriction, blood vessel constriction, vasodilation, blood vessel dilation, important for body temperature control back in Unit 2 when you were studying the skin and its functions. How do blood vessels constrict? They do that because within the walls of those blood vessels, as thin as they are, you have smooth muscle tissue that's capable of contracting when needed to make those walls, make the diameter of those blood vessels smaller. That helps increase blood pressure, or it'll cut off the blood supply to parts of the body where you don't want blood flowing. Okay, and here's this is a diagram which just kind of illustrates some of the differences between skeletal, cardiac, and smooth muscle tissue for you, and I'm showing you some example locations. And you can see here is what skeletal muscle tissue would look like under the microscope. And you may remember maybe from back in Unit 2 that the individual cells in skeletal muscles are long and cylinder shaped like they're showing you down here. And they're actually multinucleated, that word right there, multinucleate cells. So they're very long cells in some cases, and they have more than one nucleus inside them. Cardiac muscle cells also look striped under the microscope. They're striated, which you can see there if you're taking a close look at the diagram. And another unique feature about them is that they're actually branched. So if you got a cardiac muscle fiber right there and one over here, they have branches between them to connect them. And you'll learn in Biology 202 that that's important for the integrity of the heart. You think about your heart, the walls of your heart have to contract and relax and contract and relax and contract and relax for your entire lifetime. So those branches that are connecting the muscle cells or the muscle fibers in there helps keep the heart put together, basically. I'm going to write this up here again just to start emphasizing it. Now I'm going to be using the term muscle fiber a lot during this unit, and a muscle fiber is one muscle cell. In your skeletal muscle and in your cardiac muscle, these cells are long and cylinder shaped like you see down here, so that's where they get the name fiber. They look like a fiber or a string. All right, and then again, there's, like I was drawing on the previous slide, there's what a smooth muscle cell would look like if you looked at smooth muscle tissue under the microscope. It would have that type of stringy appearance. The individual cells in there are very flat, and even the nuclei in there look compressed. So that kind of has a characteristic appearance when you look at it under the microscope. All right, special characteristics of muscle tissue. What can muscle tissue do that many other types of tissues cannot? Excitability is one of its characteristics, and this is also referred to as responsiveness or irritability. So muscle tissues can actually receive and respond to stimuli, something that's going to tell that muscle tissue to constrict, or to contract. So contractility, that's another special characteristic. So the individual fibers and cells within muscle tissue are capable of contraction and then relaxing. Those contractions generate force that's required for movement, so that's contractility. Extensibility. Muscle tissues are extensible. That means that they can be stretched or elongated. And elasticity. So you can stretch out. Muscles tissues are extensible. Muscles can be stretched out, but then they'll also rebound really well back into their original positions. That's called elasticity. So they're very elastic, and that's, of course, important for their function as well. All right, so major muscle functions. Now the key function that we're going to be discussing in this unit, movement of bones. Muscles pull on skeletal muscles pull on bones to generate movements. They don't push on them, they actually pull as they contract. Like when I do this with my elbow joint, my biceps brachii muscle here in my upper arm is actually pulling on the radius. Remember the radial tuberosity from the skeletal system chapter, and as that happens, the elbow joint flexes. So movement of bones, that's going to be the main aspect of muscle function we'll be talking about here during this chapter. But muscles are also responsible for squeezing fluids through the blood. You have smooth muscle in the walls of your blood vessels, like we talked about, that contract and cause that to happen. Movement of urine through the urinary tract. Movement of the lymph fluids through your lymphatic vessels. Those types of things require contraction of smooth muscle. Maintaining posture and body position, like I just talked about. So you do have muscles, skeletal muscles contracting even when you're not moving. Otherwise you would just fall down to the ground like a big ball of jelly. Stabilizing your joints, keeping your joints in proper positions. And that's somewhat related to posture and body position as well. So again, we've got all these voluntary skeletal muscles, but very often they're contracting without us thinking about it as well. Heat generation. We've heard a little bit about this before. Heat is given off as a byproduct of cellular respiration. If you remember that from Unit 2, those are the processes by which the complex chemical reactions that take place when you're breaking down nutrients to harness energy for making our favorite fuel molecule, ATP. And as you break down your nutrients, not all of that energy is harnessed. Some of that energy winds up escaping in the form of heat. And warm-blooded animals like us use that to help maintain body temperature, but it also is responsible for the overheating that you experience when you exert yourself, like when you're out working in the yard on a hot day or you are exercising. All right, so that's just kind of a general overview of the muscular system. Again, from this point forward, we're going to be focusing in on skeletal muscles, so I may not use the phrase skeletal muscle every time, but for the rest of this for the rest of Unit 4, Just keep in mind when I'm saying muscle, I'm really referring to your skeletal muscles. That doesn't mean that cardiac muscle and smooth muscle don't have many things in common with skeletal muscle in terms of how they function, but there are some differences, and you will likely hear some of those differences when you take A&P2. But for now, we're mainly going to be focusing in on the skeletal muscles, and our next lecture will actually be about the structure of skeletal muscles. What are some of the parts of a skeletal muscle?